Few people have contributed as much to the well-being of Manitobans as this woman, Muriel Smith. And most of her accomplishments, especially for women, were uphill battles, achieved without benefit of role models, mentors, or the encouragement of the world around her. She is honored in Canada and internationally for her work advancing equal opportunities for women, and she's been named an officer in the Order of Canada. Young women like Muriel Lipsey, born in 1930, were expected to be content simply to marry and have children.
Well, I think I'd grown up with a feeling I could do anything because we were two girls in the family, and my dad was very good with each of us. My mother had been a nurse, and she had had quite an independent life before she met my father. She was 9 years older, which was quite unusual in those days, but it was a happy marriage. And but she had always said, had she not met the right man, she would not have married. So I had that model of someone who, believes she could manage in the world alone. I was a little more influenced by the teeny bop magazines and so on, to think that I had to follow the traditional patterns. And I only knew about nurse teacher and nursing teaching and stenography as options. But my curiosity was much wider. I loved science. I loved tramping around with my dad at the mining town when he'd go up and want to look around what the works and so on. And I loved geography and world history and so on. So, I didn't feel confined in my own head, but I think in terms of what I thought I could do, I had more limited views.
Married with 4 growing children, she still had the energy to think about the community and the larger world. Some of her political awareness came from her education at the University of Manitoba and at Oxford University.
I'd lived in England right after the war, and I think that influenced me, maybe not in individual models, but the Labour government had come in, and I had stories about how the health and education programs that they brought in had made a real difference in people's lives. Little kids' teeth used to be little black stubs, because they weren't getting their milk and orange juice and so on. And the Labour government brought in the national health system, but it also opened up the education system. Up until then, unless you were from a moneyed family, you didn't get past what we would consider grade 8. And so they were opening up the secondary modern schools and so on, and giving avenues for advancement. I saw that in living color, as it were. So I saw the role of the state playing an important role, as well as what my family had traditionally done, opening up the wilderness to industry and creating jobs. So I began to see a kind of richer mix as needed.
Other values were sparked by her childhood memories of the nightmarish broadcast speeches of Adolf Hitler. Still others by the training she received to qualify as a professional counselor and teacher. A personal theory of empathic communication.
Having your say is important, but so is understanding others and trying to facilitate the process. So I really believed in that, and as far as I figured, I was just a part of this ongoing process. Remember, I'd grown up during war years, and the extremism of Hitler on the radio, made a great impression on me as a 10-year-old, 10, 11-year-old. People I don't think it hit all 10, 11-year-olds that way, but it did me. And that fear of extremism and absolutism stayed with me. So I was really interested in the process of dialogue and social change over time. Like things they're not just black and white. They can evolve over time. And I actually found when I studied I was always interested in the history of philosophy, the history of economics, the history of literature. The same theme will be used, but it will be presented a little differently during whatever times it is. And of course that made me think, well, the present things can change. So I had a real belief in the possibility of change, but that it wasn't something I could just command. I had to work with other people and find varying ways of promoting it. So in a sense I had a way of dealing with pride and, ego that kind of I could keep middle ground and back down a little if I found that I was being too pushy for the group I was with, in terms of trying to persuade. So it gave me a lot of inner flexibility, I think.
Long before her public life with Manitoba's New Democratic Party, Muriel Smith was inspired by the 1967 report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women that had revealed the scope and the severity of the systemic injustices faced by Canadian women. Muriel honed her skills at the YWCA and in nonpartisan feminist projects designed to educate women. One of them was a popular guerrilla skit called The Balloon Lady, which featured a woman carrying balloons, each one representing a law pretending to protect women, but in fact holding them back from independence.
One by one they would go through these balloons and prick them. So that was, gave a kind of dramatic pop to it. But they went around to all the women's organizations, the Women's Institute throughout the countryside, the business and professional women in the city, certainly the YW and all its branches and so on. So they had really animated, I think they went up north too, although I'm not so sure about that, but that animated the women to the issues. So when the report came out and recommended very strong changes in law, we were part way to being informed.
Muriel Smith had discovered that in Manitoba, as elsewhere, women were far more dependent on men than they realized. She did her homework.
It showed how every woman was, in a sense, a married woman, one man's goodwill away from welfare. Should they separate, she and the children would be treated, given welfare level support, and the man would have the rest on the assumption he'd found another family. Well, women started to say, well, this isn't fair, this isn't fair. And then it went on to, many of us were better educated than our parents had been. And we'd raised children. We had our families quite young right after the war. We still had energy and interest in things. So we began to think, well, with our education, we would like to have a more fulfilling involvement, whether it's a volunteer organization or paid. So there was a whole movement that was going on. It was very energizing, and I think it brought together for me a lot of the passions really that had been developing over time.
Once it dawned on her that getting to make decisions and policy was infinitely better than being a petitioner, Muriel Smith ran for a seat in Manitoba's legislature. It wasn't easy. She was defeated in 1973, again in 1977. But motivated by the need for real social change, she ran for the leadership of the New Democratic Party in 1979, losing again. But she persevered and took her place as an MLA in 1981. The taste of that victory was sweet.
Not only that, it was not just me, but there were 5 other women running in the NDP and 2 in the Conservatives that won. And before that, there had occasionally been one woman, but not always even one. So the breakthrough of getting 7 women into the legislature, all I can remember was the headiness, the excitement of it all.
Shortly after, she was named Deputy Premier in Howard Pawley's government, the first woman in Canada to achieve that status.
I had to be taught, in a sense, how to handle questions, but I also had an ethic of my own about that. I believed in better communication between the government and the people, so I always wanted to answer as honestly as I could and admit what I didn't know or what was left yet to be done. I never took to the stonewalling on things, or trying to with bravado, trying to promote something that I didn't believe in, or in a way that I couldn't feel comfortable with.
Muriel Smith went on to shoulder 4 different and intense ministries: economic development and tourism, community services, status of women, and labor and housing. She survived many storms, but one of them stands out: a community split over the abortion clinic of Henry Morgentaler.
Morgentaler was a doctor from the East who had pioneered the work in reproductive rights for women, and abortion was one of the rights. There was great resistance here in the city. A group of nurses, volunteers, established a clinic. It happened to be in my riding, but that was not particularly relevant. And he was pushing to get more legitimacy and more access in hospitals and so on, or not having to go through the screens that were there. They really were just allowing therapeutic abortions. The women, mostly women, but not all, in the demonstration were wanting to push the government to open access in the hospitals. And I think our cabinet had agreed to a filter of, I think it was 3 doctors. If you could get permission of 3 doctors, you could, and if it was fairly early term. But 3 doctors was quite a big filter for a woman to have to go through and to find access to that. Yeah, it just didn't add up. So I felt strongly that I wished the cabinet could have gone further, but I'd had voice in the cabinet. I had my say. All of us women did, but we got them to loosen it up a little, but not a lot. So I still felt loyalty to the people who were demonstrating. I knew change had always come about because of people who got together and pushed government. Government doesn't often without the pressure, take a step. So I believed in what they were doing, and I also believed in my role in government. I had an obligation to listen and respond as honestly as I could. But none of my colleagues would go, and they all had different reasons. I've discussed it with them since. But anyway, out I went, and I got through saying, my piece. We're a government of mixed ages, mixed ethnic groups. We come from different experiences. This is as far as we've been able to get, but without the work you do and will continue doing, things won't improve. So I've sort of tried to state what I thought was being true to myself, but also conforming to the confidentiality that we had in cabinet. And it was my view of government, that that's how government should function. Well, that was fine. Well, then someone came up after and threw their arms around my neck, and a tear or so came. And so, of course, media next day, front page, tear, the minister cries or something. But they were saying, why are you crying? That was the question they asked me. I said, because it's a very difficult and serious issue, and I guess I have deep feelings about it. Like, I wasn't apologetic about crying. But anyway, the tear got front page coverage. I gather later they sort of called me Teflon woman, that things didn't stick. the negative criticism didn't stick. But you know, that was a very difficult experience, and yet I felt I'd done what I believed in.
Muriel Smith had always identified as a feminist, but even she was taken aback by the extent of some unspoken issues around women. The idea of domestic violence was just coming out of the shadows.
It was just emerging. I think we had the first crisis lines that we put in, and the shelter came later. There was the battered child phenomenon in the 70s. You might remember there were conferences and so on about the battered child. But the idea of battered women, I think, hadn't in the House of Commons. I think an NDP MP from Vancouver, she had referred to the battered woman syndrome and was laughed out of the House. I mean, people laughed, and that was in the 80s. So in a sense, we were pretty well at the forefront of tackling many of those issues. And no, people didn't understand what it meant. It was, I don't know if they go so far as to say women should know their place and comply with the male in their household or whatever, but certainly that was there. It's so much of the, when I think about it, there wasn't even a vocabulary.
For this work, and for her determination to see Indigenous women seen and heard on Indigenous and family issues, Muriel Smith received abundant awards and recognition, but she accepted it cautiously.
There's a deep inner satisfaction and surprise, I guess, but I once read a story by Saki, who's English. That was the pen name of somebody, Monroe, I think, and it was in a little village where the little children were playing around in the mud and all this, whatever, when a wolf came to attack the little town, and the little girl who had her very shiny white dress because she never spilt things, and the jangling medals because she had received all sorts of medals and awards for being good. The medals jangled and the white dress shone, and the wolf came and snapped her up. Whereas the little boys, who were all muddy and grubby and had been running around and whatever, the wolf couldn't see them and they escaped. So I developed a kind of ironic view of awards. That they're very nice, but you don't do things for the recognition. You do them because intrinsically there's something in you that feels they're important.
A political career, she says now, is a wonderful choice for women or for men, with one proviso.
The one thing is some passion for which they really want to make a difference. Because if you just go in because you think it's sort of an interesting thing to do, and there's prestige and maybe a paycheck or whatever, I mean, you might survive, but I don't think you would ever either get much satisfaction or probably deliver anything of great value. Although some people probably emerge, but to me, it's the passion that you feel, it's the fire in the belly that you feel that is more important than your own ego. It's because you want to go into politics because you see that in a democratic society, that's how decisions for the larger group are made, and that if you come to the feeling that you want to play a role, but as I say, not for yourself, not for the superficial, but because the issue is really important, then I think you go into it with a sense of mission, but along with that has to go some realization that you can't force your passion on others. You can share it. You also have to listen to their passion and try to see how it comes together. But if you really you really care about what you're trying to do, I think you develop a tenacity and an ability to stick with it.